This video is about repository access. There are a number of operators that allow objects to be stored in and retrieved from the RapidMiner repository. Additional operators allow repository entries to be managed. This video shows these operators being used. We'll look at retrieving from the repository, which will allow us to consider the difference between relative and absolute paths. We'll look at the different things you can store in a repository. Then we'll store something. Then we'll move an entry within the repository. We'll copy entries, rename them, and finally delete entries. I've created a process. I've also created a view to try to show everything in one place to make it easier. So the process starts by making some data and also some other types of I/O object. The details don't matter. Then there are various other operators here, storing, moving, copying, and so on, and we'll go through them one by one, and you'll notice I've set breakpoints on these to make it easier to explain what's going on. To help explain the things you see, I'll click this button here. This is the operator execution order. Sometimes can be helpful to work out where you are in a process. So I'll refer back to this as we go through. First thing, let's run the process and look at the data that comes out of this sub-process here. So I've run it. There are three things basically. There's an example set, which is the iris data set. You can see it here. There's inside that sub-process a decision tree model has been created. You can see it here. And I've also created a thing called a performance vector, which is a prediction of how that decision tree would behave on unseen data. And it's not seen as a performance vector, and it's a different sort of object. So essentially what we've got here are three different types of object: example set, model, performance vector. All of those can be stored in the repository and therefore retrieved and so on. So let's look at storing the performance vector first. If you remember, if I click this button, that's going to be the next operator that's executed. So if I run until the next breakpoint, we should break at this store performance vector. There'll be no output from this, but by looking in the repository here, we'll see something turning up. We'll examine the parameters of this to work out what's going to happen. So I'll press go. Let's look at what happened. So you can see that this has turned up in a location within a repository called first location. And you can see if I look at the parameter here, first location, iris, cross-validation result. If we look at the date and time here, you can see that I can tell you it is indeed 6:45. So we can be fairly confident that it's actually done something. If we look at the details of that parameter, basically what you do is you select where your repository location is. You obviously give it a name, and then you can decide whether to resolve the location relative to the top level of the location where the process is held, or you can do this. You can do essentially you can turn that off, and as you see, if I turn off and on this, you can see that the location changes. So if I save it with that set to true, you should see here that's exactly what got transferred into the repository entry here. If I set this like so, now the full path has been passed in. Now it's a matter of preference as to what you use. I tend to use the default, which I think is that. I think usually a little bit of practice to get that right, but essentially it's relatively straightforward. Okay, so let's recap. So basically I've got a thing called a performance vector that's come out of the sub-process. I've stored that performance vector in the repository, and you can see here it is. The little icon here gives you a clue that it's a performance vector. I leave my mouse over it, and indeed you get the pop-up on the mouse. So the next one that we'll run, we'll go to the store model operator. This is just storing again in the repository. This time it's going to store in a place called first location iris decision tree, and it's basically the model. Press run. Now what we should see is, there it is, there's the decision tree that's come out of the first sub-process, and I've stored that in the repository. No surprise there. The next one is I'm going to store the example set. So again, if I run the process again, now I've broken at this point here. There is actually an output now, so something shows up down here, and now we're seeing the iris example set copy. If I click on this, you can see that's the name that I gave it here. So far so good. Now we're going to move on to the move repository entry. So I'll click on the operator. So again, this time it's basically saying you can move something in one repository. It doesn't have to be the same repository, as long as it's in the same machine. You can move it from one location to another, thereby deleting it in the first location. So that's the next one that's going to be executed. So as soon as I run this, what should happen is that the entry iris example set copy, which is here, will get moved to a place called second location, which is currently empty. If I run, I've set a breakpoint before and a breakpoint after. So now this is the before, so nothing has turned up in the second location. As soon as I run this now, we should see a change. So sure enough, moved iris data is the new name of the original, which was in the first location, and you can see they moved. Now let's look at copy repository. So again, this doesn't delete the source entry. So here I am copying the thing called moved iris data from second location essentially back to the first location. So again, I'll run. There is a breakpoint before, which you can see by right mouse clicking, actually breakpoint before, breakpoint after. So I'm going to run this now. So moved iris data is indeed still at the second location. Now when I run this, that will stay, but there'll be a new version of that data with the name iris example set copy in the first location. Sure enough, there it is, and the original hasn't changed. So the next one is rename repository entry. So this takes an existing entry, IO object, in this case an example set. It's going to give it a new name called delete me. And again, if I select this button here, you'll notice you can't actually choose anything other than the current repository you're in. You'll also notice there's an overwrite parameter. This allows you to overwrite with the new name if there's something there already. I've set that to be off. So if I run this now, again we'll break before, and what we should see when we run this, we should see the moved iris data change its name to delete me. Sure enough, it's changed. So now we'll get to the final operator, delete repository entry. So this time you can probably guess this just is going to delete the thing called delete me. So again, if I run this, this is the breakpoint before, so this is how we are at the beginning. If I run now, we should see that the object called delete me has been deleted, which is as predicted, and I can now run the process to completion. So there we go. So that's just about everything you could ever want to know about moving things around in the repository.